Hey, and welcome back, guys. This is session number Ah! Hey, and welcome back, guys. This is session number 47 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. In this session, we're going to move away from our end times chapter, the times about apocalypse and all that good stuff, and jump into chapter number 14, where we'll start with Jesus celebrating the Passover with his disciples. We're going to sit down at that table with Jesus and his disciples and talk about what's going on as stories within the story, because there is cultural background that we need to understand to appropriately. Because there's stories that we need to understand, the cultural background that we need to understand as stories within the story to help us understand the text. So let's go ahead and dive right into the text, why don't we? And it reads like this: "And on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, 'Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?'" Now, these first couple of phrases are really important here. The first day of unleavened bread. There's a ton of cultural markers that we have to be aware of as we read this text. And this one is the first one, the first day of unleavened bread. It starts here. What is it? What is the first day of unleavened bread? Well, it harkens back to the Israelites' time in Egypt and the haste with which they had to leave Egypt during what we know as the Exodus, right? So it takes time to make leavened bread. So making and eating unleavened bread for the Israelites actually reminded them how quickly they had to leave Egypt when they were delivered from Egypt by God. So it reminded them of God's faithfulness. And their eating of unleavened bread, and eating unleavened bread isn't unlike what we do with our own cultural dishes, right? In our own communities. There's certain dishes that we cook that remind us of our heritage. And it's the same thing with the Jewish people. They did this with the unleavened bread, so it reminded them of God's faithfulness in delivering them from Egypt. You can find that actually in Exodus 12:15, where it says that 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove the leaven out of your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. So as you can see, it's very serious. They needed to eat that unleavened bread to remind them of how faithful had been God. So as you can see, they had to eat that unleavened bread to remind them of how faithful God had been to them. Now, this passage is actually occurring on what we know as Maundy Thursday. And that's just a early church term used to show that this happened on a Thursday before the crucifixion, which was going to happen on the Friday, the next day. And on the Jewish calendar, this is called the Nisan, which actually occurs around March or April, which is why we in Western culture actually celebrate Easter around March or April, because this happened around this time. Now, Christmas, that's a totally different story. Can't get into it. Probably didn't happen in December. Way too cold for shepherds to be out in the fields. But for the most part, the March-April timeline, most scholars agree, is when the Easter season happened, or when the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus happened. All right, so next up we have the Passover lamb. We see it here, right? So this actually also celebrated deliverance from Egypt, where the blood of the lamb was smeared on the doors of the Hebrews as their houses were passed over when a death plague came upon Egypt and their firstborn. So around this time, the Passover time, festival time, there were a lot of lambs being slaughtered. In fact, a couple of decades later, Josephus, who's a Jewish historian, would write that in 66 AD, 255,000 lambs were slaughtered in the temple. That's a lot of lambs. That's like a super duper family reunion barbecue cookout going on, right? But here's the stipulation, though. That Passover lamb actually had to be sacrificed and eaten in Jerusalem, in the city. They couldn't take it out of the city. They had to sacrifice and eat the Passover lamb in Jerusalem, which is where Jesus is right now, in Jerusalem. And this is actually grounded in a Old Testament practice as well. You want to look at, I'm running out of space here, but look at Deuteronomy 16:5-6, and you'll see where it says, you may not offer the Passover sacrifice with any of your town. And you'll see it says, you may not offer the Passover sacrifice within any of your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, but at the place that the Lord your God will choose, which was Jerusalem, ultimately. But you might be able to tell that this whole feast of unleavened bread and the Passover lamb actually point to a far greater reality in the Gospels. The true Passover lamb would indeed be sacrificed in Jerusalem. And we'll see that later in this chapter, that the Lord's Supper represents partaking of that Passover lamb in a very specific way. But we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. I just wanted you to see those two cultural markers here that are in place to show you that culture matters. You have to understand the culture in order to understand the passage that you are looking at. What else does it go on to say? It says, he sent two of his disciples and said to them, go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where is my guest room? Where may I eat the Passover with my disciples? I want to look at a few things here. So this might sound familiar to you because Jesus used a similar method. Now this might sound familiar to you because Jesus used a similar method to secure a colt for him to ride into Jerusalem on. We covered that in the previous session. And he sends two disciples again. He has that 2x2 thing. When he sent them out to do some missions, he sent them 2x2. And when he sent them to get the colt, he sent them 2x2. So then he sends two out this go around and sends them to a very specific person in the city, a man carrying a jar of water. Let's talk briefly about that man. Why is this significant? Well, in this culture, two groups of people actually carried water. You know who those are? You probably can guess one, women, and the other is actually slaves. So we know the woman at the well had a jar. We know Sarah had a jar in the Old Testament when she brought water to the well as well. So this was a duty assigned to women, was to go and draw water very early in the morning. And it was also a duty assigned to slaves to carry jars of water. But Jewish men generally did not carry jars of water. So what does that mean for us? Well, this may have been a prearranged thing by Jesus. He may have asked this man to carry a jar of water to be identified, right? Maybe a secret mission of sorts. Maybe a secret mission of sorts. We don't know. We don't really know. But with so many people in Jerusalem at the time, it was still a providential mission, a mission of God, from God, one that Jesus already knew about. So Jesus knew that this man would be in the city carrying the water at that moment when the men arrived, and that they would have a house to go to in order to celebrate this Passover. So this episode shows that Jesus, though he's about to be arrested and crucified, is always in control in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is always in control. All right, let's talk about this guest room real fast. In this culture, not like in our own culture, when people come in town, there's an expectation that you're going to have a guest room ready for them, especially when you know that they're coming. And because it's the Passover, this would be a time where people knew people were going to be coming into time. And because this is the Passover, people knew that people were going to be coming into town. So Jesus sends word ahead. Where's my guest room? Have my pillow, my blanket, all that stuff ready. I am coming. I'll be there soon. So he will show you a large upper room furnished and ready. They're prepared for us. And the disciples set out and went to the city, and just like he told them, found it just as he had told them. And they prepared the Passover. Briefly, I want to talk about this upper room. Does that sound familiar? Well, if it does, that's because there's evidence that this may have been the same upper room we read about in Acts chapter 1, where the Holy Spirit falls on the disciples on the day of Pentecost. If this was the same location, that means that it is Mary's house, one of the many Marys, but she's actually the mother of John Mark, who happens to be the author of this gospel. So we're not sure if that is the case. Scholars aren't sure. Some disagree, but it might be that same upper room where they actually prepared the Passover here and then actually celebrated the day of Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit fell on the disciples. So it could be that same upper room there. So, and when it was evening, he came with his disciples, and as they were reclining at the table, remember, they reclined in this culture. They didn't have chairs. They would lay head first, feet out, as they're reclining at the table, laying on their sides and eating. Jesus says to them, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." And they began to be sorrowful and to say to him, one after another, "Is it I?" Now, I want to talk about this briefly because there's a direct reference here to Psalm 41:9. You want to take a look at it if you want to. I want to take a look at this because there's a direct reference. I want to take a look at this because there's a direct reference to Psalm 41:9, where it says, "Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me." Now, this is a psalmist writing thousands of years beforehand, but Jesus here is recalling that psalm as he talks about what is about to happen to him. Again, God's sovereignty and providence at work here in the text. And he said to them, "It is one of the 12. They asked him a question, "Is it I?" And he said, "It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the dish here with me." Now, here's the thing about Jesus's answer to them. It's ambiguous. It's one of the 12. He knows who it's going to be, right? So why does he say it's Now look at Jesus's answer here. It's ambiguous, right? He knows who it's going to be. So why do we see the ambiguity here? Well, because I think it causes some introspection on the disciples' parts, some self-examination, if you will. They want to determine whether their thoughts, words, or actions have indeed betrayed Jesus. And while we know that Judas is the one who ultimately betrays him by selling him out, we'll actually see later in this chapter that the other disciples betrayed him in other ways. They denied him. They were fearful. They were weak. So the resounding question to answer here. So the resounding answer to their question, "Is it I?" at least in their moments of weakness, is yes. Indeed it is you. And this ambiguity on Jesus' part, and this ambiguity on Jesus' part actually invites us to the table as well and requires some of that same self-examination. Is it I? And Jesus says, "For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to the man by whom the Son of God is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born." Let's briefly talk about this, because a lot of people use this as a attack on Christianity by saying that Judas had no choice, that God sovereignly chose him for destruction. So let's talk about this, right? What does that mean? Well, I enjoy what one commentary says about this. It says that divine providence, or God's sovereignty, neither cancels human freedom nor relieves responsibility for moral choices, so that Judas, in his freedom to choose, makes a terrible moral choice. Of course, God knew about that beforehand. Of course, Jesus was compassionate. Jesus was long-suffering towards Judas, but ultimately his heart and his moral failure actually caused him to fall away from Christ. And Jesus says it would have been better for that man if he had not been born, right? So here's the ultimate thing that I think is the thing that captures the essence of this text. And that is that the Passover is a reminder of God's grace in spite of our shortcomings. Now, the Israelites knew this, right? They celebrated this. The disciples eventually would get there. They would know this. And I think that we need to know and remember this as well, that Jesus' willingness to dine with Judas until the very end showed his long suffering. It showed his patience and many of the things that many of us wouldn't have with someone we knew would betray us. So here's the thing I want to encourage us with. May we extend the same measure of grace to other people, despite their shortcomings. That's what Jesus did. That's what Jesus modeled here with Judas. And that's what the Passover table invites us to as we commune with people in our various spheres of life, whether it be whether it be work, whether it be home, or whether it be whether it be work, whether it be home, or whether it be in any other social setting. May we extend that same measure of grace to other people. All right, folks, that's been session number. All right, folks, that's been session number 47 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. Up next is session number 48. Can't wait. Looking forward to it. All right, folks, that's been session number 47 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. Can't wait. All right, folks, that's been session number 47 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. Next up is session number 48. Can't wait. Looking forward to it. Grace and peace to you all.